Go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights, find that spot on the pillow that stays cool and let your shoulders drop. We're going to be here for a while. Tonight, we aren't looking for excitement, and we certainly aren't looking for outrage. We are going to walk through the back rooms of American history, the dusty storage closets and the dimly lit hallways that the textbooks usually skip over. The title says disturbing, but perhaps a better word is human. History isn't a clean marble statue, it's a construction site. It's noisy, it's messy, and the foundations are often poured in the middle of the night when nobody is watching. But here is the thing about that mess. It held up. The structure survived. So, as we move through these 101 moments, we aren't here to judge the architects for their muddy boots. We are here to appreciate that, somehow, against the odds of their own flaws, they managed to build a roof that didn't collapse. So let's take a deep breath. Forget the dates you had to memorize for a test. Forget the polished portraits of men in wigs staring strictly into the middle distance. Imagine them instead as tired people, working without a manual, trying to keep a very fragile experiment from falling apart. To understand the hidden framework of this country, you have to look at the money first. That brings us to our first reality check, a fact that sits quietly at the bedrock of American law enforcement. Fact number one, the United States Secret Service wasn't created to protect the president. In fact, on the day Abraham Lincoln signed the legislation creating it, April 14, 1865, he was assassinated that very evening. The agency wasn't there to save him because that wasn't their job. Their job was to save the dollar. At the time, the American economy was essentially a hallucination. Following the chaos of the Civil War, distinct and unregulated banks were printing their own notes. There was no standard. If you walked into a general store in Ohio, you might pay with a bill drawn from a bank in Kentucky that didn't actually exist. It's estimated that 1/3 to 1/2 of all currency in circulation was counterfeit. Imagine trying to run a modern economy using monopoly money, except half the players are drawing their own, get-out-of-jail-free cards on napkins. The disturbing reality was that the government had zero control over its own value. The constructive outcome, however, was the realization that for a nation to exist, its promise to pay had to be ironclad. They didn't build a bodyguard unit. They built a financial immune system. The Secret Service was established to hunt down counterfeiters, to methodically scour the country and tell the public, this piece of paper is real, and that one is a lie. It was a dull, bureaucratic accomplishment that stabilized the heartbeat of American commerce. Without that initial, unglamorous crackdown, the industrial boom that followed would have been built on sand. And speaking of shaky foundations, let's look at how the government got its hands on money before they had a massive tax agency. Fact number two, the federal government's first real flex of power wasn't against a foreign invader. It was against Pennsylvanian farmers who liked their whiskey. This was the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Now, the school books frame this as a rowdy protest, but the reality was much more precarious. The newly formed United States had dragged itself out of the Revolution with a massive credit card bill and no revenue. Alexander Hamilton, looking at the ledger with what we can assume was a migraine, decided to tax distilled spirits. For the farmers on the frontier, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was a currency. They distilled grain because it was easier to transport over the mountains in liquid form. Taxing it felt like the government was taxing their paycheck before they even cashed it. They revolted. They tarred and feathered tax collectors. It was violent and ugly. But here is where the hinge moment happens. George Washington could have ignored it, or he could have acted like a tyrant. Instead, he did something unprecedented. He got on a horse. The sitting president of the United States rode out at the head of a militia, larger than the army he led during the Revolution, just to make a point. The point wasn't to kill farmers. In fact, by the time Washington's massive force arrived, the rebels had mostly gone home. The victory wasn't in the combat, it was in the showing up. It was the moment the abstract idea of the United States became a physical reality that could walk into your backyard. It proved the federal government could mobilize, could enforce its laws, and importantly, could show restraint once the point was made. It was the first time the landlord actually showed up to collect the rent, proving the building was actually managed by someone. This tension between what the law says and what the government can actually get away with leads us directly to one of the biggest real estate deals in history. Fact number 3. The Louisiana Purchase was technically illegal, or, at the very least, completely unconstitutional according to the man who bought it. Thomas Jefferson was a strict constructionist. He believed if the Constitution didn't say you could do it, you couldn't do it. The Constitution said absolutely nothing about the president having the authority to buy 828,000 square miles of land from a French dictator. But here's the thing about principles. They often evaporate when you're offered a bargain. Napoleon needed cash for his wars in Europe, and he offered the entire middle third of the continent for $15 million. That breaks down to about 3 cents an acre. Jefferson was paralyzed. He knew he didn't have the authority. He drafted a constitutional amendment to allow it, but his advisors told him, "Tom, by the time we pass an amendment, Napoleon is going to change his mind." So, he ignored his own deeply held philosophy. He effectively impulse bought the Midwest. The disturbing part is the executive overreach, the idea that a president could just redraw the map because the price was right. But the constructive outcome is undeniable. It transformed the U.S. from a coastal experiment into a continental power without firing a single shot. It was a massive, peaceful expansion that secured the Mississippi River, the economic artery of the continent. Sometimes, the most important thing a leader can do is know when to break their own rules for the sake of the future. It was a silent, paper transaction that quietly shaped the next 2 centuries of global geopolitics. Let's drift a little further down the timeline, away from the Founding Fathers and into the era where the map was filled in, often by forces that were less than honest. Fact number 4. The Transcontinental Railroad, the iron spine that stitched the country together, was essentially built on a Ponzi scheme of land grants. The government didn't have the cash to pay the railroad companies to build across the empty West, so they paid them in land. For every mile of track laid, the companies were given huge checkerboard sections of the land on either side. This incentivized speed over quality. It incentivized building winding, inefficient routes just to grab more acreage. It was a chaotic land grab fueled by greed and poorly laid iron. But in the cool light of history, we see what was preserved. That chaotic rush collapsed travel time from months to days. It created a reliable circulatory system for goods and people that made the modern industrial economy possible. The motives were flawed, the financing was shady, but the steel remained. Speaking of those railroad tracks, let's stay with them for a moment. We think of the railroad as something that moved heavy things, coal, cattle, timber. But the most profound thing the railroads moved wasn't physical at all. It was the concept of time itself. Fact number 5. Before November 18, 1883, time was essentially a local opinion. If it was noon in Boston, it was 11:48 in New York and 12:07 in Philadelphia. Every town set its clock by the sun, which meant that trying to coordinate a train schedule across a continent was a mathematical nightmare. It was a recipe for collisions. The government didn't fix this. The railroad companies did. In a move that feels almost like science fiction today, a group of private businessmen essentially walked into a room and agreed to slice the earth into 4 zones. They didn't ask permission from Congress. They just decreed that on a specific Sunday at high noon, everyone would reset their watches. They called it the Day of 2 Noons. The disturbing part is how arbitrary it felt. Private corporations literally dictating when the sun was supposed to be overhead. But the constructive outcome was the synchronization of modern life. For the first time, the country was operating on a shared rhythm. It allowed for complex coordination, telegraph communication, and eventually, the Internet. They forced us to stop looking at the sky and start looking at the schedule, creating the invisible grid that holds the modern world together. Now, if the railroads controlled when things happened, the newspapers controlled why they happened. This brings us to the messy birth of American interventionism. Fact number 6. The Spanish-American War, which launched the U.S. as a global superpower, was largely a marketing campaign. Two newspaper tycoons, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, were in a circulation war. They didn't just report the news, they needed content. When tensions rose in Cuba, Hearst famously told his artist, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." They printed sensational, often fabricated stories to whip the public into a frenzy. It was the original clickbait, but with battleships. It sounds cynical, and it was. But here is the thing. This manipulation inadvertently created a unified national identity. For the first time since the Civil War, Northerners and Southerners were fighting under the same flag against a common external enemy. It healed the internal fracture of the Union faster than any Reconstruction policy ever could. It was a war started for profit that ended up cementing the idea of a singular American military power. While the newspapers were feeding the public lies, the food industry was feeding them something much worse. Fact number 7. At the turn of the 20th century, there was no list of ingredients on your food. Milk was often thinned with water and whitened with plaster or chalk. Meat was preserved with formaldehyde, the same stuff used on corpses. The disturbing fact here is that the government had no way to prove this was dangerous. Enter Dr. Harvey Wiley and his poison squad. This wasn't a nickname. It was a government experiment. In 1902, Wiley recruited young volunteers who agreed to eat meals laced with borax, salicylic acid, and formaldehyde just to see what would happen. They sat at a fine dining table, dressed in suits, and poisoned themselves for science. It sounds barbaric, but the result was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Those men getting sick at the dinner table forced the industry to admit that preservative shouldn't mean embalming fluid. It was the birth of the FDA. It was the moment the government decided that the free market didn't have the right to kill you for a nickel. It established the baseline of trust that allows you to walk into a supermarket today and know that the ketchup isn't going to shut down your kidneys. But if the food was dangerous, the medicine cabinet was a minefield. Fact number 8. We tend to look at the drug crisis as a modern failure, but in the late 1800s, you could buy a kit with a hypodermic needle and cocaine from the Sears Roebuck catalog. Heroin was marketed by Bayer as a cough suppressant for children. It wasn't a back alley deal. It was respectable commerce. The system was functioning on the belief that the consumer knew best. The hinge moment came when society collectively realized that chemical dependency overrides free will. It wasn't a sudden puritanical wave. It was a public health awakening. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 wasn't just a ban. It was the first time the government acknowledged that some substances are too powerful to be treated like commodities. It shifted addiction from a moral failing to a regulatory issue. It was a clumsy first step, but it built the legal framework that separates medicine from poison today. This era of dangerous consumption wasn't limited to what you put in your body. It was also about where you put your body to work. Fact number 9. We often think safety regulations are annoying red tape. That is, until we look at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. In 1911, a fire broke out in a garment factory in New York. The managers had locked the stairwell doors to prevent the workers, mostly young immigrant women, from taking unauthorized breaks or stealing fabric. 146 people died. It was a horrific, preventable tragedy, but the constructive outcome came from who was watching. A young woman named Frances Perkins was eating tea nearby and watched the workers jump from the windows. She didn't just mourn, she got to work. She later became the first female cabinet member under FDR and the architect of the New Deal. That fire didn't just burn a building, It burned down the philosophy of laissez-faire labor management. It led directly to the concept of occupational safety. Every exit sign you see in a theater, every fire extinguisher in a hallway, and every limit on room capacity is a silent echo of that day. The tragedy was the locked door. The accomplishment was that we made it illegal to ever lock it again. And just as we decided adults needed protection, we had to make an even harder decision about children. Fact number 10. In the early 1900s, the Supreme Court actually ruled that banning child labor was unconstitutional. They argued it interfered with a parent's right to contract their child's labor. It's a chilling thought. A 10-year-old in a coal mine was considered a matter of freedom. The change didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, grinding cultural shift led by photographers like Lewis Hine, who snuck cameras into mills to show the public the faces of these little workers. The accomplishment here wasn't a single law, but a redefinition of childhood itself. We moved from viewing children as small economic assets to viewing them as a protected class in need of development. It was an economic sacrifice. Families lost income, industries lost cheap labor, but it invested in the future intellectual capital of the nation. We traded short-term coal sorting for long-term literacy. If the goal was to save the children from the factories, the question became, where do we put them? That brings us to a place that everyone listening has experienced, but few realize was designed as an industrial machine. Fact number 11. The American public school system was modeled explicitly after the Prussian military and industrial complex. The rows of desks, the ringing bells to signal transitions, the emphasis on rote memorization, none of that was designed to create creative thinkers. It was designed to create punctual employees. In the early 20th century, the captains of industry didn't need poets. They needed people who could sit still for 8 hours, follow instructions, and not break the machinery. It feels cynical to realize your childhood classroom was essentially an assembly line for compliance. But here is the constructive twist. By standardizing education, by treating it as a utility like water or electricity, the U.S. accidentally created the most literate workforce in human history. The intent was obedience, but the outcome was empowerment. Once you teach a population to read so they can understand a manual, they can also read a ballot, a contract, or a philosophy book. The system meant to create workers inadvertently created a middle class capable of demanding better rights. They built a cage, but handed everyone the key. Now, while the schools were shaping minds, a very different kind of chemistry was shaping the legal system. Fact number 12. During Prohibition, the government was so desperate to stop people from drinking that they ordered industrial alcohol to be poisoned. They knew bootleggers were stealing industrial solvents to resell as spirits, so federal agents mandated the addition of lethal chemicals like kerosene and mercury. It wasn't a secret. It was a deterrent. Thousands of people died. It was a grim low point for federal ethics, but from this darkness emerged the science of truth. New York City's medical examiner, Charles Norris, and his toxicologist, Alexander Gettler, couldn't stop the poisoning, so they decided to prove it. They developed the first systematic methods for detecting toxins in the human body. Before this, murder by poison was almost the perfect crime. Natural causes was the catch-all for anything mysterious. Norris and Gettler turned the morgue into a laboratory. Their work during Prohibition didn't just expose the government's tactics, it invented forensic toxicology. Every episode of CSI, every toxicology report in a murder trial traces back to this moment. The tragedy of the speakeasy forced science to catch up with crime, creating a system where the dead could finally speak to the living. Speaking of hazardous workplaces, let's talk about the glow-in-the-dark watch dial. Fact number 13. The Radium Girls were young women hired in the 1920s to paint luminous numbers on watch faces. They were told the paint was harmless. They were even encouraged to lick the brushes to keep a fine point. They literally ingested radiation all day, glowing like ghosts when they went home at night. When they began to rot from the inside out, jaws disintegrating, bones shattering, the company claimed they had syphilis to smear their reputations and avoid paying. It is a story of absolute corporate villainy, but the hinge moment is what these women did with their dying breaths. They didn't just fade away, they sued. And they sued loud. For the first time, the legal system had to grapple with the concept of occupational disease, an injury that doesn't happen in a sudden accident but slowly over years. Their legal battle paved the way for the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration (OSHA) decades later. The concept that a company is responsible for the long-term biological effects of its environment on its workers exists because those women refused to go quietly. They paid for safety standards with their lives, forcing the law to recognize that a paycheck shouldn't come with a death sentence. As we moved out of the 20s and into the 30s, the economic floor fell out. The Great Depression broke the country, but it also forced the government to invent a way to keep people in their homes. Fact number 14. Before the 1930s, buying a house was nearly impossible for the average person. You typically needed a 50% down payment, and you had to pay the loan off in 3 to 5 years. It was a rich man's game. When the Depression hit, millions of people were foreclosed upon because the terms were simply unlivable. The government's solution was the Federal Housing Administration, FHA. They didn't build houses. They built an insurance policy for banks. They told the banks, if you give these people 30-year loans with small down payments, we will back you up if they default. This invented the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. It sounds like boring banking math, but it was a revolutionary technology. It transformed homeownership from a luxury into the primary vessel of middle-class wealth. It allowed a factory worker to own a piece of the earth. While the implementation had deep, painful flaws, specifically redlining, which locked minority communities out of this wealth-building machine, the mechanism itself was a triumph of stability. It anchored families to communities, creating the suburban landscape that defined the American mid-century. But just as we were stabilizing the home front, the world abroad was falling apart. World War II is usually taught as a map of battles, but the biggest victory might have been in a petri dish. Fact number 15. In 1941, an Oxford policeman named Albert Alexander scratched his face on a rose bush. The scratch got infected. He was dying of sepsis. Doctors tried a new experimental mold juice called penicillin. It worked like a miracle, clearing the infection, until they ran out of the drug. They even tried to filter it back out of his urine to reuse it, but it wasn't enough. He died. The disturbing fact is how close we came to losing this. The U.S. government realized that if they invaded Europe, more soldiers would die from infected scratches than from bullets. They took this mold, which was incredibly difficult to grow, and treated it like the Manhattan Project. They didn't just fund it, they re-engineered the entire fermentation industry. They searched the world for a better strain of mold and found it, ironically, on a moldy cantaloupe in a market in Peoria, Illinois. That rotting melon saved millions of lives. The accomplishment wasn't just the discovery of antibiotics, it was the industrial scaling of them. By D-Day, there was enough penicillin for every wounded soldier. We went from recycling urine to mass production in 3 years. It was the moment medicine scaled up from a boutique practice to a global shield, effectively ending the era where a simple cut could be a death sentence. So we had the medicine to keep soldiers alive, but bringing them home created a new, terrifying problem. This brings us to a moment where the government acted not out of generosity, but out of fear of its own citizens. Fact number 16. When World War II ended, 16 million Americans were in uniform. The government was terrified. They weren't just worried about unemployment. They were genuinely afraid that millions of battle-hardened young men returning to a jobless economy would lead to another depression, or worse, a violent revolution. The GI Bill wasn't originally designed as a thank you gift. It was an economic parking lot. The goal was to stall the veterans from entering the workforce all at once. They offered to pay for college not because they wanted a nation of philosophers, but because they wanted to keep men out of the job market for 4 years. The disturbing context is that the government viewed its own heroes as a potential mob, but the constructive outcome was the complete democratization of higher education. Before this, college was for the elite, the sons of doctors and lawyers. Suddenly, the son of a mechanic sat next to the son of a banker. It created the modern middle class. It proved that intelligence wasn't a genetic trait of the aristocracy. It was a resource that could be mined from anywhere. The stall tactic inadvertently created the most educated workforce the world had ever seen. And while those veterans were studying, the government was busy building a way to move them around. Fact number 17. You probably think the interstate highway system, those massive ribbons of concrete like I-95 and I-80, was built for family road trips and commerce. It was. It was built for tanks. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had seen the German Autobahn during the war, and he realized the U.S. was a logistical nightmare. If the Soviets invaded, we couldn't move our army across the country fast enough. The legislation was literally called the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act. The overpasses were designed to be high enough for missiles to pass under. The disturbing part is that to build these roads, engineers often plowed straight through vibrant, often minority, neighborhoods and cities, effectively destroying communities to pave the way for suburban commuters. We cannot ignore that scar. But the hinge moment is what the system did for national unity. It collapsed the distance between New York and California. It created a unified culture where a product made in Ohio could be sold in Florida the next day. It turned a collection of states into a single, accessible market, allowing the average person the freedom of movement that was previously reserved for the wealthy. But while we were building roads on the ground, we were looking nervously at the sky. And to get there, we had to make a deal with the devil. Fact number 18. The U.S. space program, the pride of American ingenuity, was largely engineered by men who had built rockets for Adolf Hitler. This was Operation Paperclip. The U.S. government secretly brought over 1,600 German scientists, technicians, and engineers, whitewashing their records to bypass Truman's anti-Nazi orders. Wernher von Braun, the architect of the Saturn V rocket that took us to the moon, had previously used slave labor to build V-2 rockets that rained death on London. It is a profound moral stain. It suggests that justice is negotiable if your intellect is valuable enough. But we have to look at the constructive outcome without blinking. These men didn't just build weapons. They built the vehicle for humanity's greatest exploration. The technology they developed didn't just put a flag on the moon. It launched the satellites that now monitor our weather, route our GPS, and connect our phones. It is an uncomfortable truth that the view of Earth from space, that beautiful blue marble that united us ecologically, was launched on a rocket designed by a former enemy. While we were looking at the stars, down on Earth, people were realizing that no one was coming to save them. Fact number 19. Until the late 1960s, if you were in trouble, there was no number to call. You had to dial 0 and hope the operator wasn't busy or know the specific 10-digit number of the local police station. The catalyst for change was the murder of Kitty Genovese in 1964. The story reported at the time, which was later found to be exaggerated but still culturally potent, was that dozens of neighbors heard her screaming and did nothing. The disturbing realization wasn't just about apathy. It was about the friction of getting help. People didn't know how to help efficiently. This panic led to the creation of 911. It seems so simple, but it was a radical infrastructure project. It required rewiring the entire telephone grid to recognize a 3-digit code as a universal override. The constructive outcome was the democratization of emergency response. It meant that a child, a panic-stricken victim, or a tourist didn't need knowledge or connections to summon the state's protection. They just needed 3 buttons. It shrank the time between tragedy and help, saving countless lives by removing the barrier of complexity. And just as we connected people to help, we started trying to connect computers to each other. Fact number 20. The Internet, the tool you are likely using right now, wasn't built to share cat videos or recipes. It was built to survive a nuclear holocaust. In the 1960s, the Department of Defense realized that their communication network was centralized. If the Soviets nuked a central hub, the entire military command would go dark. They needed a network that looked like a fishnet, not a wheel. If you cut one knot, the signal would just travel around it. This became ARPANET. The disturbing origin of the Internet is total paranoia, the expectation that the world was going to end. But the constructive outcome was the invention of packet switching. Instead of a dedicated line between two people, information was broken into little digital envelopes that could take any route to get to the destination. This architecture is what makes the modern world possible. It made information impossible to kill. Designed for war, it became the ultimate tool for free speech and global connection. The irony is that a system built to coordinate nuclear strikes ended up being the system that allows you to stream a bedtime story. We've talked about systems that connect us, roads, phones, the Internet. But what about the systems that control who we actually are? This brings us to the quietest, most underestimated revolution in American history. Fact number 21. In 1960, the FDA approved a drug called Innovid. You know it as the pill. The disturbing backstory is that the clinical trials were conducted on women in Puerto Rico who were often not told they were part of an experiment, and many suffered severe side effects that were dismissed by researchers. It was biocolonialism, plain and simple. But the constructive outcome was a seismic shift in human autonomy. For the first time in history, biology was not destiny. Women could decouple sexuality from reproduction. It didn't just change the bedroom, it changed the boardroom. It allowed women to plan careers, delay families, and enter the workforce in waves that the economy had never seen before. It was a pill that effectively doubled the intellectual capital of the nation, even if the road to its approval was paved with ethical failures. While the population was changing, the environment was collapsing. Fact number 22. In 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland didn't just flood, it caught fire. The water was so saturated with oil and industrial waste that it burned with flames 5 stories high. This wasn't even the first time it had happened, but it was the time that broke the public's indifference. The disturbing reality is that until that moment, there were essentially no rules against dumping poison into the water. It was considered the cost of progress. The constructive outcome was the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, created by Richard Nixon, a man who wasn't exactly a tree hugger. The river burning forced the government to acknowledge that freedom does not include the right to set the geography on fire. It established the principle that the air and water are public trusts, not private sewers. And speaking of poisons we ignored, let's look at the one the government actually subsidized. Fact number 23. For decades, the U.S. government gave cigarettes to soldiers in their rations. Tobacco was a pillar of the economy. But in 1964, Surgeon General Luther Terry released a report that explicitly linked smoking to cancer. Here is the hinge. He released it on a Saturday. Why? To minimize the crash of the stock market. That's how powerful tobacco was. The government was terrified of the economic fallout. The accomplishment here isn't that smoking stopped overnight. It didn't. The accomplishment was that the government officially turned against a major industry for the sake of public health. It was the moment the state admitted, "We have been wrong and this product is killing you." It began the slow, 50-year war against big tobacco that has saved millions of lives. Now let's look at a law that no one thought would matter, but changed everything. Fact number 24. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. Before this law, American immigration was based on a racist quota system from the 1920s designed to keep the country white and Protestant. If you were from Britain, come on in. If you were from Asia or Africa, the door was effectively locked. President LBJ signed the 1965 Act downplaying it, saying, "This bill is not a revolutionary bill." He was wrong. It was perhaps the most revolutionary bill of the century. It abolished the quotas. It opened the doors to skilled labor and family reunification from everywhere. The disturbing context is that they only passed it because they didn't think many people from those other places would actually want to come. They were wrong about that too. The constructive outcome is the modern, multicultural United States. If you look around today at the diversity in tech, medicine, and the arts, it all flows through the pen stroke of that one minor bill. It inadvertently proved that Americanism is an idea, not an ethnicity. And finally, to close out our hidden framework era, we have to look at the money again. Fact number 25. In 1971, the money stopped being real. President Nixon severed the U.S. dollar from the gold standard. This is often framed by economists as a disaster or a theft. And the disturbing part is true. The money in your pocket is essentially an IOU based on nothing but faith in the government. But here is the constructive flip side. By untethering the dollar from a static supply of shiny metal, the U.S. gained the ability to manage economic crises. When the world locks down, like in 2008 or 2020, the Federal Reserve can expand the money supply to prevent a total collapse. It turned money from a rigid anchor into a shock absorber. It's a terrifying amount of power, yes, but it's the only reason the global economy can survive modern shocks without returning to the Stone Age. Act 2, the dark middle. So we have the framework. The banks, the roads, the pills, and the laws are in place. But now we move into the darker middle chapters, the 1970s and 80s. This is the era where the government stopped building things and started trying to control things, often with disastrous results. Let's slow down for a second. Imagine a quiet classroom again. But this time, the lesson is about what happens when the government tries to keep secrets. Fact number 26. We think of the FBI as the good guys fighting crime. But in 1971, a group of activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and stole 1,000 documents. They mailed them to the press. These papers revealed a program called COINTELPRO. The files proved the FBI was blackmailing civil rights leaders, spying on students, and even sending a letter to Martin Luther King Jr., suggesting he kill himself. It was state-sponsored psychological warfare against its own citizens. It is deeply disturbing, but the constructive outcome was the Church Committee. For the first time, Congress dragged the intelligence agencies into the light. They set up permanent oversight committees. It established the legal principle that the spies are not above the law. Before this, the CIA and FBI answered to no one. After this, they had to answer to the Senate. It didn't fix everything, but it put a leash on the watchdog. This era of exposing secrets brings us to the greatest scandal of them all, and the surprisingly boring law that fixed it. Fact number 27. Watergate wasn't just about a break-in. It was about the president using the IRS and the CIA to punish his enemies. It was the executive branch weaponized. The constructive outcome wasn't just Nixon resigning. It was the strengthening of the Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) in 1974. President Ford actually vetoed this bill, thinking it gave the public too much power. Congress overrode him. This is the hinge. Because of this moment, you can demand documents from the government. It shifted the default setting of American democracy from secret unless revealed to public unless exempted. It gave journalism and history a legal crowbar to pry open the filing cabinets of power. But while the government was trying to hide its files, it was also trying to hide its mistakes in the desert. Fact number 28. Throughout the Cold War, the U.S. tested hundreds of nuclear weapons in Nevada. They told the downwinders, the people living nearby in Utah and Arizona, that there was no danger. They lied. Cancer rates skyrocketed. The disturbing fact is the government knowingly sacrificed its own rural citizens for the sake of the arms race. But the outcome, decades later, was the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. It was a rare instance of the sovereign admitting guilt. It established a precedent that the government is liable for the biological safety of its military decisions. It forced the military to internalize the cost of its own negligence, changing how they assessed risk forever. If the government was finally admitting to the poisons in the desert, they were much slower to admit to the poisons they were injecting into people. This brings us to the single darkest chapter in American medical history, and the rigid shield it eventually created. Fact number 29. For 40 years, the U.S. Public Health Service ran the Tuskegee study. They tracked hundreds of black men with syphilis but never treated them. Even after penicillin became the cure in the 1940s, the doctors withheld it. They wanted to see how the disease killed the men. They watched them go blind and insane, and they called it science. It is a stomach-turning betrayal. But when the story finally broke in 1972, it didn't just end the study. It destroyed the old way of doing medicine. It led directly to the Belmont Report. This is the document that invented the concept of informed consent. Before this, a doctor was like a god. They didn't have to explain anything to you. After this, they had to prove you understood the risk. It created the Institutional Review Board, IRB. Today, you cannot run a clinical trial or even a psychological survey without an independent committee ensuring you aren't hurting anyone. It built a permanent ethical wall between the researcher and the human being, ensuring that curiosity never again outranks dignity. While medical ethics were being rewritten, the suburbs were discovering that their lawns were hiding secrets, too. Fact number 30. In 1978, in Niagara Falls, New York, trees began to die. Then, black sludge started oozing into people's basements. This was Love Canal. It turned out the entire neighborhood, and the local elementary school, had been built on top of 21,000 tons of toxic chemical waste dumped by a company years earlier. The disturbing part wasn't just the poison. It was that the company argued they had sold the land, so it wasn't their problem anymore. The law actually agreed with them. The constructive outcome was the creation of the Superfund program. It established a terrifying but necessary legal principle: retroactive liability. The government decided that you are responsible for your mess forever. Even if you sold the land, even if you followed the laws at the time, if your waste hurts someone today, you pay. It forced corporations to treat waste not as something you throw away, but as something you have to babysit for eternity. It changed the math of pollution from free to infinite liability. Speaking of changing the physical world, let's talk about a revolution that happened in a hallway. Fact number 31. In 1977, the longest occupation of a federal building in U.S. history took place. It wasn't an armed militia. It was a group of people with disabilities, many in wheelchairs, some deaf or blind, who refused to leave the Health, Education, and Welfare Office in San Francisco. They were fighting for the implementation of Section 504, a law that had been ignored for years. They slept on the floor, assisted each other with hygiene, and held out for nearly a month. The FBI cut the phone lines, so the deaf protesters used sign language out the windows to communicate with supporters on the street. The disturbing context is that, until this moment, American society essentially believed that if you couldn't climb stairs, you didn't belong in public. The constructive outcome was the first real recognition of accessibility as a civil right. It is the reason we have curb cuts on sidewalks today. It's the reason for ramps, automatic doors, and elevators in schools. That sit-in forced the architecture of the entire country to bend to fit the person, rather than demanding the person fit the architecture. While we were making the ground accessible, the sky was becoming a dangerous place. Fact number 32. In the late 1960s and early 70s, hijacking a plane was incredibly common. It happened almost once a week. It was often political, sometimes just for ransom. People could walk onto a plane with a ticket and a handgun because there was zero screening. Security was considered un-American. The hinge point came when the airlines realized that the cost of hijackings was finally higher than the cost of slowing people down. In 1973, the FAA mandated universal physical screening. It feels annoying today to take off your shoes and empty your pockets, but the constructive outcome was the creation of the sterile zone. It was a social contract where everyone agreed to be treated like a suspect for 5 minutes so that everyone could be safe for 5 hours. It was the end of the romantic era of flying, but the beginning of the era where mass air travel could actually scale without being a chaotic gamble. And while we were worried about the air inside the plane, we almost destroyed the air outside of it. Fact number 33. By the 1980s, we discovered that the ozone layer, the invisible shield that protects Earth from solar radiation, was disintegrating. The cause wasn't a weapon, it was hairspray and refrigerators. Chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, were eating the sky. The disturbing thought is how fragile our atmosphere really is. We nearly sterilized the planet by trying to keep our hair in place. But the constructive outcome is perhaps the single greatest diplomatic achievement in human history: the Montreal Protocol of 1987. Every nation on Earth, literally every single one, ratified the treaty to ban CFCs. It wasn't vague promises, it was a hard ban. And it worked. The hole in the ozone layer is currently healing. It proved that humanity is actually capable of looking at a planetary threat and agreeing to take a financial hit to survive. It stands as the quiet, hopeful proof that we can fix what we break. Now, let's move to a fact about how we handle our money, which changed because of a piece of plastic. Fact number 34. Before the 1970s, if you were a woman, you often couldn't get a credit card without your husband's signature. Banks could legally discount a woman's income by 50% when calculating a mortgage, assuming she would get pregnant and quit. The disturbing fact is that half the population was treated as a financial dependent, regardless of their earnings. The hinge was the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. It didn't just allow women to have cards, it forced the financial algorithm to become gender blind. This didn't just help women, it exploded the economy. By unshackling the credit of half the workforce, it unleashed a massive wave of entrepreneurship and consumption. It turned women from secondary earners into primary economic drivers. It was a simple regulatory tweak that doubled the financial horsepower of the American household. If the credit card changed how we spent money, a tax loophole discovered by accident changed how we saved it. This brings us to the quiet death of the pension. Fact number 35. The 401(k) was not designed by a master economist. It was discovered by a benefits consultant named Ted Benna in 1980. He was just reading the tax code and found a paragraph, Section 401, subsection K, that seemed to allow employees to defer taxes on their bonuses. The disturbing reality is that the entire retirement system of the modern workforce rests on a legislative accident. Companies realized they could stop offering guaranteed pensions, where they took the risk, and switch to 401(k)s, where you take the risk. It shifted the burden of survival onto the worker. But the constructive outcome was the democratization of investing. Before this, the stock market was a rich man's club. The 401(k) forced the average worker to become an investor. It poured trillions of dollars of middle-class capital into the markets, fueling the tech booms of the 90s. It gave regular people a direct stake in the growth of the economy, for better or worse, turning every paycheck into a tiny bet on the future. While we were securing our financial future, we suddenly realized we couldn't trust the products on our shelves. Fact number 36. In 1982, 7 people in Chicago died because they took Tylenol. Someone had taken bottles off the shelf, laced the capsules with cyanide, and put them back. The country panicked. Police drove through neighborhoods with loudspeakers warning people to throw away their medicine. The disturbing fact is how vulnerable we were. Before this, you could open any food or drug container in a store, touch it, and put it back without a trace. The hinge moment was the response from Johnson & Johnson. They recalled everything, 31 million bottles. It cost them $100 million. But then, they invented the tamper-evident seal. The foil on your yogurt, the plastic ring on your milk, the pop button on your jar of salsa, all of that exists because of those 7 tragic deaths. It created a layer of industrial trust, a physical guarantee that says, no one has been here before you. And while we were learning to listen to safety warnings on bottles, we were learning the hard way what happens when you ignore warnings in meetings. Fact number 37. The Space Shuttle Challenger explosion in 1986 is seared into the national memory. We all know the O-ring failed because of the cold, but the disturbing truth revealed by the investigation was that the engineers knew. They begged NASA not to launch. The managers, under pressure to keep a schedule, silenced them. It was a failure of culture, not just chemistry, but the constructive outcome was the Rogers Commission report. It revolutionized how large organizations handle dissent. It introduced the concept of safety culture, the idea that the lowest-ranking engineer can stop a launch if they see a risk. It moved the needle from obey the chain of command to respect the data. This didn't just fix NASA. It changed how hospitals, airlines, and oil rigs operate, prioritizing the voice of the technician over the voice of the schedule. As technology advanced, it started to offer answers to questions we thought were unsolvable. Fact number 38. For most of human history, if the police said you committed a crime and you confessed, even under duress, that was it. Case closed. Then came 1989 and the first DNA exoneration in the U.S. Gary Dotson had been in prison for years for a crime he didn't commit. The disturbing realization was that our justice system was filled with innocent people convicted by bad science and coerced confessions. DNA profiling didn't just catch the guilty, it freed the innocent. The constructive outcome was the Innocence Project. It forced the legal system to admit it was fallible. It replaced eyewitness testimony, which is notoriously unreliable, with biological certainty. It was the moment the justice system began to transition from a game of rhetoric to a game of evidence. It proved that truth is physical, and it cannot be argued away. Around the same time, a tragedy in the sky unlocked a tool you use every day. Fact number 39. In 1983, a Korean Airlines passenger jet strayed into Soviet airspace due to a navigational error. The Soviets shot it down, killing 269 people. It was a massacre born of confusion. President Reagan decided that this could never happen again. The U.S. military had a secret satellite system for guiding missiles called GPS. Reagan signed a directive to open it to the public for free. The disturbing origin of Google Maps is a Cold War tragedy, but the constructive outcome is the blue dot. By giving civilians access to military-grade precision, we eliminated getting lost as a human condition. It revolutionized shipping, travel, and emergency rescue. It was a sword turned into a plowshare, or rather, a missile guidance system turned into a pizza delivery tracker. And finally, as we closed out the decade, we passed a law that literally rebuilt the world. Fact number 40. The Americans with Disabilities Act (ADA) of 1990. Before this, a person in a wheelchair was effectively banned from entering a library, a courthouse, or a bus if it had stairs. The fight for this law was brutal. It involved the Capitol crawl, where activists abandoned their wheelchairs and dragged themselves up the steps of the U.S. Capitol to show how inaccessible the House of the People really was. The constructive outcome is visible on every corner. The ADA didn't just ask for politeness, it demanded construction. It is the most sweeping civil rights legislation since the 1960s, but applied to the physical environment. It established the principle that society has a duty to remove the barriers it created. It redefined disability not as a personal tragedy, but as a design flaw in the world, one that we are obligated to fix. As we moved into the 1990s, the battleground shifted from the physical world, wheelchair ramps and pollution, to the information world. We started trying to label the invisible things: calories, violence, and even our own mistakes. Fact number 41. Until 1990, the words low-fat or light on a food package were essentially marketing gibberish. A company could put light on a bucket of lard if they wanted to, arguing it referred to the color, not the calories. The disturbing reality was that the grocery store was a zone of total unregulated deception. The hinge was the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act. It standardized the nutrition facts panel, that black and white box you see on everything today. It defined terms like serving size and cholesterol. The constructive outcome was that it forced the food industry to tell on itself. It turned lunch into math. While it didn't solve obesity, it established the right to know what you are eating. It treated the consumer as a chemist who deserved to see the formula. While we were labeling food, we were also trying to label the airwaves. Fact number 42. In 1996, the government mandated that every new television set had to include a V-chip. This was a piece of silicon designed to let parents block shows based on ratings. The disturbing context was the explosion of violent and sexual content on cable TV, which parents felt helpless to filter. But the constructive outcome wasn't really the chip itself. Most people never figured out how to use it. The outcome was the TV rating system, TV-14, TVMA. It was the industry admitting that not all content is for everyone. It shifted the responsibility from the censor to the parent, providing a tool rather than a ban. And speaking of tools born from helplessness, let's look at a system that turned every radio into a search party. Fact number 43. In 1996, a 9-year-old girl named Amber Hagerman was abducted in Texas. She was killed. The disturbing fact is that the police had no way to quickly tell the public to look for a specific car. The information moved too slowly. Broadcasters in Dallas teamed up with the police to create the Amber Alert. It was a volunteer system at first. The constructive outcome is that it turned the entire commuting public into deputies. It leveraged the existing infrastructure of radio and highway signs to crowdsource a rescue. To date, it has recovered over 1,000 children. It proved that the fastest way to solve a crime is to tell everyone it's happening. Now, let's look at the biggest check ever written. Fact number 44. In 1998, the major tobacco companies signed the Master Settlement Agreement. They agreed to pay the states $206 billion over 25 years. The disturbing backstory is that the states were going bankrupt treating sick smokers, while the companies were still denying cigarettes were addictive. The agreement was a surrender, but here is the constructive twist. The settlement forced the tobacco companies to fund the truth, anti-smoking ads. They literally had to pay for the commercials that told teenagers not to buy their product. It was a kind of financial judo, using the opponent's wealth to destroy their own market share. As the millennium approached, the world panicked about a different kind of bug. Fact number 45. WWII the year 2000 bug. We joke about it now as a hoax because nothing happened. But the disturbing truth is that the danger was real. The world's banking, power, and transport systems were built on code that couldn't count past 1999. The constructive outcome is that Y2K was the largest successful global engineering project in history. Governments and corporations spent billions to fix the code before it broke. It is the ultimate example of competence looks like nothing happened. We avoided a global meltdown not by luck, but by doing the boring, expensive homework ahead of time. It proved that humanity can actually see a deadline and meet it. But while we were fixing the code, we were writing a law that would break the internet wide open. Fact number 46. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, 1996. It contains 26 words that say, essentially, a website isn't responsible for what its users post. The disturbing side effect is that it allows hate speech and misinformation to flourish because platforms aren't liable. But the constructive outcome is the existence of the social internet. Without this law, YouTube, Wikipedia, and Facebook couldn't exist. If they were sued for every lie a user posted, they would have shut down in 1997. It created a safe harbor that allowed the digital town square to be built. It's a messy, noisy freedom, but it gave everyone a printing press. And speaking of messy freedom, let's look at the election that tested the system to its breaking point. Fact number 47. The 2000 election between Bush and Gore came down to 537 votes in Florida. It was chaos. Hanging chads, confusing butterfly ballots, and endless lawsuits. The disturbing part is how fragile the mechanism of democracy actually looked. A superpower was paralyzed by bad graphic design on a ballot. But the constructive outcome was the concession. Al Gore disagreed with the Supreme Court's ruling to stop the recount, but he famously said, "For the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession." In a world where power is usually taken by force, the hinge moment was a man walking away. It reaffirmed the peaceful transfer of power. It proved that the system values stability over the ambition of any single leader. Then came the day that changed the definition of security forever. Fact number 48. Before September 11, 2001, different government agencies didn't talk to each other. The FBI used paper files. The CIA used a different database. They legally couldn't share certain intel. This wall allowed the plot to slip through the cracks. The tragedy is unspeakable, but the constructive outcome was the forced integration of the government. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security was the biggest reorganization of federal power since World War II. It forced the government to act as one brain rather than 20 separate ones. It was a painful, clumsy evolution, but it ended the era of turf wars between agencies when lives were on the line. In the shadow of that attack, we also saw a quiet revolution in how we pay for things. Fact number 49. In the early 2000s, electronic tolling, like EZ-Pass, became standard. Before this, every car had to stop, roll down a window, and hand a coin to a human. It seems trivial, but the disturbing inefficiency of millions of cars idling for hours burned massive amounts of fuel and wasted years of human life. The constructive outcome was frictionless travel. It was the beginning of the Internet of Things. Physical objects, cars, talking to sensors, toll booths, without human intervention. It smoothed the flow of traffic and proved that technology could make the government's hand invisible. And finally, a small victory for privacy in a noisy world. Fact number 50. By 2003, telemarketing had become a plague. Dinner was interrupted nightly. The disturbing reality was that your phone number was considered public property. The solution was the National Do Not Call Registry. It was wildly popular. Millions signed up on the first day. The constructive outcome was the government giving you the right to erect a digital fence around your home. It didn't stop the scammers who ignore laws, but it stopped the legitimate corporations. It established the principle that your attention is yours and you have the right to opt out of the commercial noise. As we crossed the midway point of the decade, the threats stopped looking like villains with guns and started looking like weather maps and balance sheets. We entered an era where the systems we trusted, the levees, the banks, the housing market, simply evaporated. Fact number 51. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina didn't just drown New Orleans. It drowned the idea that the federal government could handle a mega disaster. The disturbing reality televised to the world was Americans stranded on rooftops, waving flags at helicopters that didn't come. The response was paralyzed by bureaucracy. The constructive outcome was the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. It sounds dry, but it fundamentally rewired how we handle chaos. It gave FEMA the authority to pre-stage supplies before a storm hits. Before this, they generally had to wait for a governor to ask for help. This law acknowledged that in an era of climate change, waiting for permission is a death sentence. It shifted the strategy from reactive aid to proactive positioning, ensuring that the water bottles are already there when the wind starts blowing. While the waters were receding, a different kind of flood was building in the financial sector. Fact number 52. By 2007, the global economy was essentially playing a game of Jenga with bad mortgages. Banks were selling bundles of loans that they knew were toxic, betting that housing prices would never fall. When they did, the world broke. The disturbing crash of 2008 wiped out $11 trillion in household wealth. But the hinge moment was the stress test. The government forced the major banks to undergo a public simulation. What happens to your balance sheet if unemployment hits 10% and the market drops 50%? If they failed, they had to raise cash. It was a humiliating public exam for the masters of the universe. But the constructive outcome is that today, the banking system is significantly more boring. Capital requirements are higher. Leverage is lower. We traded the thrill of the boom for the stability of the fortress, ensuring that a bad bet on Wall Street is less likely to foreclose a home on Main Street. And in the middle of that financial wreckage, a mysterious document appeared on the internet. Fact number 53. In 2008, an anonymous person named Satoshi Nakamoto published a white paper for something called Bitcoin. The disturbing context was a total loss of faith in institutions. People didn't trust banks to hold their money anymore. The constructive outcome wasn't necessarily cryptocurrency itself, which is still volatile, but the technology underneath it, the blockchain. It introduced the concept of the distributed ledger. For the first time in history, we had a way to prove ownership without a middleman. It's a technology that is now being used to track supply chains, verify diamonds, and secure contracts. It proved that trust can be written into code rather than stored in a vault. While we were rethinking money, we were also rethinking our own biology. Fact number 54. By 2008, genetic testing was becoming cheap. You could spit in a tube and find out your ancestry. But this created a terrifying possibility. What if your insurance company found out you had a gene for cancer and denied you coverage before you even got sick? The government got ahead of this with the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA. It's a law that most people have never heard of, but it is the firewall for your DNA. It made it illegal for health insurers or employers to discriminate based on genetic information. It preserved the future of personalized medicine. It meant you could look at your own code without handing a weapon to the people who pay your medical bills. Then came the year the ocean turned black. Fact number 55. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. A mile underwater, a well blew out, pumping millions of barrels of crude into the Gulf of Mexico. The disturbing part was that the oil industry had no plan for a leak this deep. They were literally trying to plug it with junk shots, firing golf balls and tires into the pipe. It was high-tech improvisation at its most desperate. The constructive outcome was the invention of the capping stack. The industry was forced to engineer a massive, portable device that can be lowered over a blowout to seal it. These stacks are now positioned around the world, ready to be deployed. We learned the hard way that if you're going to drill into the planet's veins, you better have a tourniquet ready. As we tried to fix the environment, we also had to fix a broken promise to a specific group of soldiers. Fact number 56. For 18 years, gay Americans could serve in the military only if they lied about who they were. This was don't ask, don't tell. Thousands of linguists, pilots, and medics were discharged simply for being honest. The hinge moment came in 2011 with its repeal. Critics predicted it would destroy unit cohesion. The disturbing fear was that soldiers couldn't handle diversity. The constructive outcome: nothing happened. The military kept marching. It proved that professionalism outweighs prejudice. It expanded the talent pool of the armed forces and aligned the military's values with the freedom they were defending. While the military was modernizing, the auto industry was on life support. Fact number 57. General Motors and Chrysler were bankrupt. If they went under, they wouldn't just close factories. They would take the entire supply chain, tire makers, glass plants, electronics, down with them. The government stepped in with the auto bailout. It was hated. It was called socialism. But here is the thing: the government didn't just write a check, it took stock. It forced a restructuring, and then the companies paid it back. The constructive outcome was the survival of the American manufacturing base. It saved an estimated 1.5 million jobs. It proved that sometimes the government has to be the investor of last resort to prevent an industrial heart attack. And while we were saving cars, we were changing how we fueled them. Fact number 58. For decades, the U.S. was dependent on foreign oil. We fought wars over it. Then came the fracking revolution. The disturbing side includes earthquakes in Oklahoma and concerns about groundwater. We cannot gloss over that. But the constructive outcome was energy independence. The U.S. became the world's largest oil and gas producer. It decoupled American foreign policy from the whims of oil cartels. It changed the geopolitical map, allowing the U.S. to engage with the world without having to beg for fuel. Then we decided to tackle the one thing everyone is afraid of: losing their health insurance. Fact number 59. Before 2010, being sick was a pre-existing condition. If you had beaten cancer or even had asthma, an insurance company could legally refuse to sell you a policy. You were uninsurable. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was messy, controversial, and fought over in court. But the hinge moment was the clause that banned the exclusion of pre-existing conditions. It fundamentally changed health insurance from a risk management business, where they try to avoid sick people, to a utility, where everyone gets access. It established the moral baseline that your past health shouldn't condemn your future survival. And finally, to close out this turbulent section, let's look at a quiet death: the death of the incandescent bulb. Fact number 60. The government passed standards that effectively banned the old Edison light bulb. People were furious. They hoarded 100-watt bulbs in their basements, claiming the government was taking away their warm light. The constructive outcome was the LED revolution. By forcing the market to move away from inefficient heat-generating bulbs, we jump-started the technology for lighting that uses 80% less energy. Today, we don't even think about changing bulbs because they last for a decade. It was a moment where a nudge from the state forced technology to leap forward, saving gigawatts of power without us even noticing the switch. As we push into the most recent years, the history becomes personal. These aren't just stories. They are things you likely remember scrolling past on your phone. And speaking of love and law, let's look at a decision that redefined the American family. Fact number 61. For most of U.S. history, the federal government defined marriage strictly as a union between a man and a woman. The Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, in 1996 explicitly cemented this. The disturbing reality was that a gay couple could be together for 50 years, build a life, and yet be legal strangers in a hospital room. The hinge moment was the Supreme Court case Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015. It didn't just legalize same-sex marriage, it declared it a fundamental right. The constructive outcome was an explosion of social stability. By allowing millions of people to access the legal protections of marriage, inheritance, taxes, visitation rights. The state strengthened the concept of family rather than weakening it. It proved that the institution of marriage was elastic enough to expand without breaking. While the courts were expanding rights, technology was expanding accountability. Fact number 62. In the past, if a police officer said you resisted arrest, that was the official record. But in the 2010s, the ubiquity of the smartphone camera changed the power dynamic forever. The death of Eric Garner and the events in Ferguson, Missouri, were the catalysts. The disturbing footage was painful to watch, but the constructive outcome was the widespread adoption of body cameras. It wasn't just civilians filming. Police departments started filming themselves. It introduced an objective third eye into the most tense interactions in society. While it hasn't solved police brutality, it has ended the era of the unverified narrative. It established the expectation that state violence must be documented to be legitimate. But while we were watching the screens, we were missing a silent epidemic in our medicine cabinets. Fact number 63. The opioid crisis. By 2015, drug overdoses were killing more Americans than car crashes. The disturbing driver was the pharmaceutical industry's aggressive marketing of painkillers as non-addictive. Doctors were prescribing pills like candy because they were told it was safe. The constructive outcome was the implementation of prescription drug monitoring programs, PDMPs. These are state-run databases that track every controlled substance prescription. If you go to a doctor in one county for OxyContin and then drive to the next county for more, the system flags you. It forced the medical system to talk to itself. It turned off the pill mills by using data to identify the outliers, shifting the focus from punishing the addict to restricting the supply chain. And speaking of data, let's talk about the man who stole the NSA's secrets. Fact number 64. In 2013, Edward Snowden revealed that the U.S. government was collecting the phone records of millions of innocent citizens. The disturbing realization was that privacy was effectively dead. If you used a phone, the government knew who you called. But the constructive outcome wasn't just a debate, it was a technological shift. Silicon Valley responded by making end-to-end encryption the standard. Before Snowden, encryption was for spies. After Snowden, WhatsApp and iMessage locked down your chats so that even they couldn't read them. The exposure of mass surveillance inadvertently created the most secure communication tools in human history, putting military-grade privacy in the pocket of every teenager. While we were locking down our data, we realized our physical pipes were poisoning us. Fact number 65. The Flint water crisis. In 2014, a cost-cutting move switched the city's water source, corroding the pipes and leaching lead into the tap water of an entire city. The disturbing fact is that officials ignored the complaints because the residents were poor. But the constructive outcome was a national awakening on infrastructure. It led to the strictest revisions of the lead and copper rule in 30 years. It triggered a nationwide hunt for lead service lines, with billions of dollars now allocated to dig them up. It ended the out-of-sight, out-of-mind era of utilities, forcing cities to prove that what comes out of the tap is actually water. Then came a movement that changed the workplace forever. Fact number 66. For decades, sexual harassment in the workplace was often handled with a settlement and a non-disclosure agreement (NDA). The predator paid money, the victim signed a paper promising silence, and the cycle continued. The Me Too movement in 2017 shattered that silence. The disturbing volume of stories revealed that harassment was systemic, not anecdotal, but the constructive outcome was the end of the forced NDA. Several states passed laws banning companies from forcing employees to sign away their right to speak about harassment as a condition of employment. It stripped the hush money mechanism from corporate HR, ensuring that money could no longer buy silence for abuse. While we were fixing the culture on Earth, a private company did something impossible in the sky. Fact number 67. Since the dawn of the space age, rockets were disposable. You flew them once and they crashed into the ocean. It was like flying a 747 from New York to London and then throwing the plane away. In 2015, SpaceX landed a Falcon 9 booster upright. The disturbing disruption was to the old aerospace giants who said it couldn't be done. The constructive outcome is the collapse of the cost of space travel. It opened the door for everything from global satellite internet to future asteroid mining. It proved that the wasteful way of doing things isn't the only way, provided you are crazy enough to try to park a skyscraper in reverse. Then the world stopped. Fact number 68, COVID-19. We all lived through the disturbing reality, the lockdowns, the fear, the refrigerated trucks, but the constructive outcome is the mRNA vaccine. This wasn't a rush job. It was the triumph of 30 years of ignored research. Scientists like Catalin Carrico had been working on mRNA for decades, often struggling to get funding. When the virus hit, they didn't have to invent the technology. They just had to plug in the code. We went from a new virus to a functional vaccine in under a year, a process that usually takes 10. It proved that when humanity focuses all its resources on a single problem, we can outrun evolution. The pandemic also forced a shift in where we work. Fact number 60. For a century, the definition of work was going to a place. If you weren't in the office, you weren't working. The pandemic forced the remote work experiment. The disturbing shock was the sudden isolation, but the constructive outcome was the decoupling of geography and opportunity. It proved that productivity doesn't require a commute. It gave millions of people back hours of their lives previously lost in traffic. It allowed people to move closer to family or nature without losing their careers. It broke the industrial tether that chained the worker to the factory floor, or the cubicle, offering a new definition of life-work balance. And finally, to close out this era of chaos and transition us into the quiet end, we looked further than ever before. Fact number 70. The James Webb Space Telescope. This machine had to be folded up like origami, shoved into a rocket, and then unfold itself a million miles away from Earth. It had 344 single points of failure. If any one of them jammed, the $10 billion telescope was trash. The disturbing anxiety was that we had put all our eggs in one very fragile basket. But on Christmas Day 2021, it launched. And over the next few weeks, it unfolded perfectly. The constructive outcome is that we can now see the light from the first stars that ignited after the Big Bang. It is a monument to precision. In an era where everything felt like it was breaking, politics, health, climate, this machine worked exactly as designed. It reminded us that we are still capable of doing difficult, beautiful things. Act 3, Quiet Closure. Now the storm has passed. We have survived the wars, the crashes, and the plagues. The final section of our journey is softer. These are the small, everyday facts, the ones about mail and birds and the quiet agreements that make life livable. Let's lower the volume. Fact number 71. Let's talk about the weather, specifically the National Weather Service. It costs every American about $4 a year in taxes. The disturbing history is that before this service, a hurricane could wipe out a city like Galveston in 1900 with zero warning. Today, the constructive outcome is that you know it's going to rain before you even step outside. It is a massive, silent government machine that exists solely to tell you to bring an umbrella. It's the ultimate dad agency, unexciting, reliable, and constantly watching the horizon so you don't have to. We've spent a lot of time talking about high stakes, wars, spies, and economic crashes. But as we enter the final stretch, I want to talk about the things you can touch. The quiet, invisible victories that are sitting in your kitchen drawer or holding up the roof over your head. These are the accomplishments that are so successful, they have become boring. Fact number 72. Go to your kitchen. Find the salt shaker. It probably says iodized salt. You've seen it 1,000 times, but that word iodized is a victory over a national crisis. In the 1920s, the goiter belt wasn't a fashion accessory. It was a swath of the northern U.S. where the soil lacked iodine. People, especially children, developed massive, painful swellings in their necks and suffered from developmental delays. The disturbing reality was that geography was making people sick. The constructive outcome was a quiet partnership between the government and the Morton Salt Company. They didn't pass a law mandating it, they just asked. They slipped a simple nutrient into the cheapest, most common ingredient on the table. Almost overnight, goiters disappeared. It was arguably the most cost-effective public health intervention in history. A fraction of a penny per box raised the IQ of the entire region. While we were fixing the food, we were also fixing the machines. Fact number 73. Imagine if every time you bought a light bulb, you had to make sure it fit the specific socket in your house because every manufacturer used a different size. That was the reality of mechanics before 1864. There was no standard screw. A bolt from one shop wouldn't fit a nut from another. It was industrial chaos. The hero was a man named William Sellers. He stood up at a conference in Philadelphia and proposed a standardized system of threads, flat at the top, flat at the bottom at a 60-degree angle. It was boring. It was technical. But the U.S. Navy adopted it, then the railroads, and then the world. The constructive outcome is that you can walk into a hardware store today and buy a bolt that fits a machine built 50 years ago. It's the interchangeable part, the silent agreement that holds the physical world together. And once we could bolt things together, we figured out a better way to move them. Fact number 74. Before 1956, loading a ship was like playing Tetris with sacks of flour, barrels of oil, and crates of furniture. It took weeks. Dock workers were often injured. Theft was rampant. Then came Malcolm McLean, a trucking guy who thought, why don't we just put the whole truck on the boat? He invented the intermodal shipping container, the steel box. The disturbing part is that it decimated the old waterfront culture and cost thousands of dock jobs. But the constructive outcome was the globalization of trade. It dropped the cost of shipping by 90%. It is the reason you can eat a banana in January and buy a television for less than a car. It turned the world economy into a single, seamless conveyor belt. Speaking of things that move seamlessly, let's talk about the most radical institution in America. Fact number 75, the public library. If you proposed this idea today, you'd be laughed out of the room. You want to buy millions of books, put them in a nice building, and let anyone, homeless or billionaire, borrow them for free. And if they lose one, we just ask for a small fine. It sounds like a terrible business model. But it is the beating heart of democracy. Supported by philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie and sustained by local taxes, the library is one of the few places in America where you are not a consumer. You are a citizen. You don't have to buy anything to be there. It preserves the idea that knowledge belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford tuition or a subscription. And while libraries brought light to the mind, the government finally brought light to the farm. Fact number 76. As late as the 1930s, 90% of urban America had electricity, but only 10% of rural America did. Private power companies refused to run wires to farms because it wasn't profitable. Too many miles, not enough customers, they said. The government created the Rural Electrification Administration, REA. They didn't just build the lines, they helped farmers form co-ops to own them. The hinge moment was the day the lights turned on in the farmhouse. It didn't just mean reading at night. It meant electric pumps for water, refrigerators for milk, and radios for news. It connected the agrarian heartland to the modern world, proving that a service can be essential even if it isn't profitable. Now, let's look at a safety feature you use every time you get in a car, which exists because a company decided to be nice. Fact number 77. In 1959, an engineer at Volvo named Nils Bohlin invented the three-point seatbelt. Before this, seatbelts were just lap straps that could actually cause internal injuries in a crash. Bohlin's design saved lives. The disturbing, norm of capitalism suggests Volvo should have patented it and charged everyone else a fortune to use it. They didn't. They released the patent for free. They decided that the value of human life was greater than the value of market exclusivity. Every time you click that belt across your chest in a Ford, a Toyota, or a Chevy, you are benefiting from a moment of corporate altruism that prioritized safety over profit. While we were making cars safer, we were making shopping faster. Fact number 78. In 1974, a pack of Wrigley's gum was scanned at a Marsh supermarket in Ohio. It was the first use of the UPC barcode. Before this, every cashier had to memorize prices or read a sticker on every single apple. It was slow and prone to error. The disturbing chaos of the checkout line was replaced by the beep. It sounds trivial, but that beep is the sound of the modern supply chain. It allows stores to know exactly what they have in stock, automatically reordering when low. It turned the grocery store from a pantry into a data center. But not all safety features are electronic. Some are purely mechanical responses to tragedy. Fact number 79. In 1942, the Coconut Grove nightclub in Boston caught fire. 492 people died. Many perished because the main exit was a revolving door that jammed when the panicked crowd rushed it. Other doors opened inward, trapping people against them. It was a nightmare, but the constructive outcome is the panic bar you see on every exit door in public buildings today. The law changed to mandate that all exit doors must open outward and must open with a simple push. We literally redesigned the hinges of civilization. We can't stop fires, but we made sure the building itself would never again fight the people trying to escape it. And just as we protected the exit, we protected the vote. Fact number 80. For a long time, voting in America was public. You shouted your vote or dropped a color-coded ticket into a box. Everyone, your boss, your landlord, your neighbors, knew who you voted for. This led to massive voter intimidation. Vote for my guy or you lose your job. The constructive outcome was the adoption of the Australian ballot, or secret ballot, in the late 19th century. The voting booth curtain. It introduced the concept of political privacy. It ensured that in the moment of decision, you are accountable only to your conscience. It severed the link between economic coercion and political voice. And finally, let's look at the land itself. Fact number 81. In 1872, the U.S. did something that no nation had ever done before. It took a massive, beautiful piece of land, Yellowstone, and said, "This belongs to nobody, which means it belongs to everybody." The National Park Service is often called America's best idea. The disturbing alternative was that the Grand Canyon would be a private quarry, and Yosemite would be a gated resort for the ultra-rich. The constructive outcome was the democratization of awe. It established the principle that some things are too magnificent to be owned. We drew a line on the map and said, "Commerce stops here." We are in the quiet hours now. The heavy lifting of history is done, and we are looking at the small, sturdy things that make up a life. The things that, if they disappeared tomorrow, you would miss instantly, even if you never think about them today. Fact number 82. The weekend. We assume Saturday and Sunday are natural laws like gravity, but for most of human history, you worked until you died. The disturbing reality of the Industrial Revolution was a 7-day work week, often 12 hours a day. The hinge wasn't just unions fighting and dying for it, though they did. It was actually Henry Ford in 1926. He wasn't being nice. He was being a capitalist. He realized that if his workers were exhausted, they made mistakes. And more importantly, if they were always working, they didn't have time to drive the cars he was selling. He gave them Saturday off to create consumers. The constructive outcome was the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which codified the 40-hour work week. It invented the concept of leisure time for the working class. It gave us the Saturday morning cartoon, the Sunday drive, and the family dinner. Speaking of things the government gave us to keep us sane, let's talk about money again. But not the gold standard, just the sign on the door. Fact number 83. Walk into any bank in America and you will see a little gold sticker. FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Before 1933, if a bank made bad bets and collapsed, your money was just gone. Poof. This led to bank runs, where panic was contagious. People would sprint to the bank to withdraw their cash, which actually caused the bank to fail. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy of ruin. The constructive outcome of the FDIC was the government saying, "Relax, if the bank fails, we will write you a check." It monetized trust. It stopped the runs not by banning them, but by making them unnecessary. That little sticker is the reason you sleep at night without worrying if your savings account still exists. And just as we guaranteed the bank account, we decided to guarantee a fair fight in court. Fact number 84. Until 1963, if you were charged with a crime and couldn't afford a lawyer, the court said, "Good luck." You had to defend yourself against a professional prosecutor. It was a system designed to crush the poor. Then came Clarence Earl Gideon. He was a drifter charged with breaking into a pool hall. He handwrote a petition to the Supreme Court from his prison cell, in pencil, on prison stationery. The disturbing fact is that thousands of people were in prison just because they were too poor to argue their innocence. The constructive outcome of Gideon v. Wainwright is the phrase you hear on every cop show. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. It created the public defender system. It's overwhelmed and underfunded, yes, but it established a monumental principle. Justice shouldn't have a price tag. The state cannot take your liberty without first giving you a shield. While the courts were protecting rights, the military was worrying about lunch. Fact number 85. The National School Lunch Act of 1946. You might think school lunches exist to help parents, but the disturbing origin is World War II. When the military drafted millions of men, they rejected a huge number of them because they had stunted growth from childhood malnutrition. The government realized that a hungry child grows up to be a weak soldier, so they made lunch a matter of national security. The constructive outcome is that today, millions of children get their only guaranteed hot meal of the day at school. It started as a way to build an army, but it ended up building a safety net for the most vulnerable citizens, ensuring that education isn't derailed by an empty stomach. And speaking of protecting children, let's look at a medical miracle that refused to be a business. Fact number 86. In the 1950s, polio was the terror of the American summer. It paralyzed children indiscriminately. Public swimming pools were closed. Parents were in a state of constant dread. Jonas Salk developed the vaccine in 1955. When a reporter asked him who owned the patent, Salk famously replied, "There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?" The disturbing norm would have been to monetize the cure and become a billionaire. The constructive outcome of his refusal was that the vaccine was distributed cheap and fast. It eradicated polio in the U.S. in roughly 2 decades. It stands as a reminder that the highest purpose of medicine is service, not profit. Salk gave away a fortune to save a generation. From biological safety to fire safety, let's look at a gadget on your ceiling. Fact number 87. The smoke detector. Before the 1970s, these were expensive industrial devices. If your house caught fire at night, you generally didn't wake up. The hinge came when technology allowed the use of a tiny speck of radioactive material, americium-241, to detect smoke cheaply. The price dropped to under $10. The government and insurance companies pushed for mandatory installation. The constructive outcome is that fire death rates in the U.S. have dropped by over 50% since then. It is a tiny, annoying plastic disc that chirps when the battery is low, but it is the sentinel that watches over your family while you dream. Now, let's talk about how we sort the nation. Fact number 88. The zip code. Before 1963, mail was sorted by hand, by people who had to memorize the geography of every town. As the mail volume exploded, the system choked. The post office introduced the Zone Improvement Plan, ZIP. They even used a cartoon character, Mr. Zip, to sell it. The disturbing resistance came from people who felt they were being reduced to numbers. They felt it was dehumanizing. But the constructive outcome was the automation of connection. It allowed machines to sort the mail. And more than that, it gave us a way to organize data. Public health, demographics, and real estate all rely on the zip code today to understand how communities function. It turned the chaos of a continent into a searchable grid. And while we were sorting mail, we were making TV accessible. Fact number 89. Closed captioning. It started in the 1970s solely for the deaf and hard of hearing. It was a hidden signal that required a special expensive box to decode. The hinge was the Television Decoder Circuitry Act of 1990, which mandated that the chip be built into every new TV. The constructive outcome is the curb cut effect, a feature designed for disability that helps everyone. Today, captions are used in noisy bars, by people learning English, and by tired parents watching Netflix while the baby sleeps. It proved that when you design for inclusion, you usually end up making the product better for the entire population. Let's look at the air we breathe, specifically what we put in our cars. Fact number 90. Unleaded gasoline. For decades, we put lead in gas to stop engines from knocking. We were essentially aerosolizing a neurotoxin into the faces of our children. The disturbing fact is that the industry fought the ban for years, knowing the danger. But the constructive outcome of the phase-out, completed in the 90s, was a measurable drop in violent crime and a rise in IQ scores across the entire population. By removing one chemical from the air, we essentially gave the whole country a brain upgrade. It is the ultimate proof that environmental regulation isn't just about saving birds, it's about saving our own minds. And finally, for this section, let's look at a show that taught us how to feel. Fact number 91. The Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. This created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPB, which gave us NPR and PBS. In 1969, a soft-spoken man named Fred Rogers went before the Senate to save the funding. He didn't talk about economics. He recited the lyrics to a song about managing anger. He told the grumpy senator, "I think it's much more dramatic that two men could be working out their feelings of anger than the showing of something of gunfire." The disturbing context was a TV landscape filled with mindless violence and cartoons. The constructive outcome was Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Sesame Street. These weren't just shows, they were national preschools. Research shows that kids who watched Sesame Street had better grades in high school. The government decided to fund kindness because the market wouldn't. It preserved a quiet corner of the culture where it was okay to be gentle. We are almost there. The heavy machinery of history has slowed down. We are left with the small, quiet things, the artifacts of our humanity that don't make headlines but make life feel like life. Fact number 92. In 1902, President Teddy Roosevelt refused to shoot a black bear that his guides had tied to a tree for him. It was unsportsmanlike. A cartoonist drew the incident, and a candy shop owner in Brooklyn asked permission to call his stuffed bears Teddy's Bears. The disturbing context of the era was that nature was viewed as a monster to be conquered. Bears were pests, but the constructive outcome of this toy was a psychological shift. It rebranded the wild. It taught generations of children to view animals not as enemies, but as friends to be cuddled. It was the first step toward the conservationist mindset that would eventually save the real bears in the woods. Fact number 93. Before the 1930s, there was no such thing as a teenager. You were a child, and then, around age 14, you went to work and became an adult. The Great Depression forced a change. There were no jobs, so the government banned child labor and made high school compulsory just to keep kids out of the workforce. The disturbing origin is that high school was essentially a holding cell for unemployment, but the constructive outcome was the invention of adolescence. It created a buffer zone between childhood and responsibility, a few extra years to learn, to socialize, and to mature. It gave us youth culture, rock and roll, and the space to figure out who we are before we have to punch a clock. Fact number 94. In 1939, books were expensive hardcovers, symbols of status. Then came the paperback revolution. The publisher pocketbooks decided to print classics on cheap paper and sell them at newsstands for 25 cents. The disturbing fear from the elites was that this would cheapen literature. They thought if you could buy Shakespeare next to a pack of gum, it lost its value. The constructive outcome was the democratization of the mind. Soldiers carried them in cargo pockets, workers read them on the bus. It proved that the value of a book is in the words, not the binding. Fact number 95. In 1968, a scientist at 3M named Spencer Silver was trying to make a super-strong glue for aerospace. He failed. He made a weak, gummy adhesive that barely held anything. It sat on a shelf for years until a colleague used it to mark his hymnal in church. This became the post-it note. The constructive outcome is the celebration of the happy accident. It changed how we communicate, informally, temporarily. It is a monument to the idea that a failure in one context is a solution in another. Fact number 96. The public bench. It seems simple, but in many cities, loitering was a crime. The installation of benches in parks and on sidewalks was a quiet revolution. The constructive outcome is the assertion of the right to rest. It acknowledges that you don't have to be buying something or going somewhere to exist in public. You are allowed to just sit. It is a small architectural gesture of hospitality from the city to the citizen. Fact number 97. In 1972, the crew of Apollo 17 looked back and snapped a photo of Earth. It is known as the blue marble. Before this, we had maps. Maps show borders, countries, and divisions. The disturbing reality of the Cold War was that we saw the world as us versus them. The constructive outcome of that photo was that it showed no lines. It showed a lonely, fragile blue ball in a vast darkness. It became the symbol of the environmental movement and a reminder that, from a sufficient distance, we are all on the same team. Fact number 98. In 1977, we launched the Voyager probes. Attached to the side is a golden record, a phonograph containing sounds of Earth, rain, wind, Mozart, and greetings in 55 languages. The disturbing probability is that aliens will never find it. It is a message in a bottle thrown into an infinite ocean, but the constructive outcome isn't for the aliens, it's for us. It was an exercise in optimism. We had to decide what was worth saving about humanity, and we chose art, nature, and hello. It is a permanent testament that we were here, and we tried to be good. Fact number 99. The snooze button. It appeared on clocks in the 1950s. Efficiency experts hate it. It ruins your sleep cycle. But historically, it represents a tiny rebellion against the industrial machine. It is the technological embodiment of just 5 more minutes. It is a daily, low-stakes mercy we grant ourselves. Fact number 100. The eradication of smallpox. In 1980, the World Health Organization declared the world free of smallpox. It is the only human disease we have ever completely defeated. It killed kings and peasants for thousands of years. The constructive outcome is the proof of concept. It proved that if the USA, the Soviet Union, and every other nation cooperated, we could literally wipe a plague off the face of the earth. It stands as the high-water mark of what humanity can do when we stop fighting each other and start fighting the problem. Fact number 101. This isn't a historical event in a textbook, but it is the statistical culmination of everything we have talked about. The disturbing reality is that history is a meat grinder. The wars, the plagues, the famines, the crashes, any one of them could have broken the chain of your ancestors. But they didn't. The constructive outcome is that you are here, listening to this. You are the result of the medicine that worked, the laws that held, the ships that didn't sink, and the love that survived the hard times. The hidden framework held up long enough for you to arrive. Outro. So here we are, 101 facts later. We started with counterfeit money and ended with a golden record floating in the stars. We walked through the fires of the Industrial Revolution, the cold calculations of the atomic age, and the noisy confusion of the digital world. If there is one thing to take with you into sleep tonight, it is this. The version of history they taught you in school was often a list of dates and battles, a highlight reel of great men doing great things. But the real history, the disturbing, messy, beautiful history, is a story of repair. It's the story of how we realized the food was poisonous, so we hired chemists to fix it. How the factories were dangerous, so we wrote laws to guard the machines. How the world was too big and disconnected, so we built roads and wires and satellites to stitch it together. None of it was perfect. The framework is still creaking, the floorboards still squeak. There are still leaks in the roof that need fixing tomorrow, but the house is still standing. The disturbing facts remind us that we are capable of terrible mistakes, but the constructive outcomes remind us that we are also capable of fixing them. We are a species that breaks things, yes, but we are also a species that buys glue and patches holes and tries again. So let your breathing slow down. The systems are humming in the background, the electricity is flowing, the water is treated, the laws are written. The satellites are watching the storm. You don't have to carry the weight of history tonight. It has already happened. It has been built, specifically so you can rest. History is just the long, slow process of us learning how to take care of each other. And for tonight, the work is done. If you slept through the last 50 facts, that's a win. If you're still listening, that's okay too. Just close your eyes. The world will still be there in the morning. Good night. We have reached the end of our 101 facts. The sun has set, the house is built, and the main story is told. But since we are still here and the night is long, let's look at a few things that didn't quite fit the list. The stories that are too strange, too specific, or too unbelievable to be essential, but are too fascinating to ignore. Think of this as the secret track at the end of the album. Bonus fact A, the Great Molasses Flood. In 1919, a massive tank of molasses in Boston burst. This wasn't a slow leak. It was a tsunami of syrup moving at 35 miles per hour. It killed 21 people. It sounds like a cartoon joke, but it was a horrific industrial disaster. The disturbing reality was that the company tried to blame it on anarchists, claiming a bomb had been planted. The constructive outcome was the court case that followed. It was one of the first times a court relied heavily on expert technical witnesses, engineers and metallurgists, to prove that the tank was structurally unsound. It helped establish the requirement that an engineer or architect must stamp and certify plans for public safety. It turned engineering into a regulated profession with legal accountability. Bonus fact B, the time the U.S. government planned to nuke the moon. In the late 1950s, the U.S. was losing the space race. The Soviets had launched Sputnik. Morale was low. The Air Force developed Project A119. The plan was simple and terrifying. Launch a nuclear bomb at the moon and detonate it on the visible edge so that half the world would see the mushroom cloud. The disturbing logic was purely psychological, a show of strength to terrify the Soviets. The constructive outcome is that they decided not to do it. Scientists, including a young Carl Sagan, calculated that the scientific fallout would ruin the moon for future research. It was a moment where the value of future knowledge won out over a momentary flex of military muscle. It preserved the moon as a pristine archive of solar system history. Bonus fact C, the toy that was actually a radioactive lab. In the early 1950s, the Gilbert U-238 atomic energy lab kit was sold to children. It came with a Geiger counter and 4 jars of actual uranium ore. The disturbing fact is that we let kids play with radioactive material on the living room rug. But the constructive outcome is the generation of physicists it inspired. While dangerous, it demystified atomic energy for a generation. Many of the scientists who later worked on safe nuclear power or medical radiology traced their interest back to these dangerous toys. It was a reckless era, but it sparked a curiosity that built the modern energy sector. Bonus fact D. The bat bomb. During WWII, the U.S. developed a plan to strap tiny incendiary bombs to Mexican free-tailed bats. The idea was to drop them over Japanese cities, where the bats would roost in the eaves of wooden buildings and burn them down. The disturbing part is the sheer absurdity of weaponizing nature. The constructive outcome came from the testing. The bats escaped and burned down the brand-new Air Force base where the experiment was happening. It proved, hilariously and conclusively, that biological weapons are uncontrollable. It was a key lesson that helped steer the military away from unpredictable animal-based weapons and toward precision technology. Bonus fact E. The $1,000,000 punctuation mark. In 1872, a tariff law was passed listing items that were tax-free. It was supposed to list fruit plants, but a clerk added a comma by mistake. Fruit plants. This meant all fruit and all plants were suddenly tax-free. Importers noticed immediately and stopped paying taxes. The disturbing incompetence lost the government nearly $2 million, a fortune back then. The constructive outcome was a rigorous overhaul of legislative drafting. It birthed the modern obsession with syntax in legal codes. It taught the government that grammar is not just about style, it is about revenue. Bonus fact F. The man who saved the world by doing nothing. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet submarine captain named Vasily Arkhipov was underwater, cut off from radio contact. American destroyers were dropping depth charges to signal him to surface. The captain of the sub thought war had started and ordered a nuclear torpedo launch. He needed approval from 3 officers. Arkhipov refused. He stood his ground while the other officers screamed at him. The disturbing fact is how close we came to annihilation because of a communications blackout. The constructive outcome is simply that we are here. Arkhipov's refusal is the greatest non-event in history. It proved that the final firewall against Armageddon isn't technology. It's human judgment and the courage to say no when everyone else is saying fire. Bonus fact G. The Phantom City of Aglow, New York. In the 1930s, mapmakers put a fake town called Aglow on a map of New York State. It was a copyright trap. If another company's map had a glow on it, they would know it was stolen. Decades later, they found a glow on a Rand McNally map. They sued, but Rand McNally won. Why? Because people had looked at the first map, driven to that spot, and built a general store called the Aglow General Store. The fake town had become real because the map said it was there. The constructive outcome is a lesson in the power of information. We build the world we describe. It's a whimsical reminder that reality is often shaped by the stories we tell about it. Bonus fact H. The invention of jaywalking. Before the 1920s, the street belonged to everyone. You could walk wherever you wanted. Cars were seen as dangerous intruders. The auto industry launched a massive PR campaign to shame pedestrians. They invented the slur J, which meant a country bumpkin, and promoted the crime of jaywalking. The disturbing part is that a private industry successfully criminalized walking, but the constructive outcome was the organization of traffic. It created the predictable flow of the modern city. By segregating cars and people, it allowed cities to grow vertically and densify, creating the modern metropolis. Bonus fact I. The day the music died, literally. In 1942, the American Federation of Musicians went on strike. They banned their members from recording any commercial music. This lasted for 2 years. The disturbing silence meant no new instrumental music was on the radio, but the constructive outcome was the rise of the singer. Because the strike didn't apply to vocalists, who weren't considered musicians, by the union, record labels started recording a cappella or vocal-heavy songs. This shifted American music from big band orchestras to the era of the solo star, Frank Sinatra, and later Elvis. The strike accidentally invented the modern pop star. Bonus fact J, the Great Emu War honorable mention. Okay, this is Australian, but U.S. military observers took note. Australia declared war on emu birds that were eating crops. They sent soldiers with machine guns. The emus won. They used guerrilla tactics, scattering when fired upon. The disturbing fact is that a modern army was outsmarted by birds. The constructive outcome was a lesson in humility and ecology. It taught governments that you cannot simply shoot an environmental problem. It led to better fencing and agricultural planning, proving that adaptation is usually cheaper and more effective than brute force. Final good night, the real one. We really are done now. That's the thing about history. If you keep digging, you will always find another shard of pottery, another lost letter, another mistake that turned into a miracle. The script is long, but the timeline is longer. You have the framework, you have the stories. Now you have the silence. Sleep well.